Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first of three webinars in our Season on Springs series. My name is Michael Edmonstone, and I'm the Communications and Engagement Lead here at Shoal. Shoal mobilizes urgent conservation attention for the world's most threatened freshwater species, and through the landmark 1000 Fishes initiative, aims to catalyze conservation attention for 1000 of the planet's most threatened freshwater fishes by 2035. Season on Springs is a chance to celebrate these tiny, often overlooked ecosystems that support a disproportionate level of biodiversity relative to their size. Springs support a remarkable diversity of life, including lots of endemic species that have been shaped by many thousands of years in isolation. They are also vital to people as sources of fresh water, sustaining river flows and holding immense cultural value for people around the world. In October 2025, at the IUCN World Conservation Congress in Abu Dhabi, the global conservation community took a significant step towards attention for springs. Motion 016, Springs Under Threat, Mobilizing Urgent Action for Neglected Freshwater Ecosystems, was formally adopted, calling for coordinated global action to protect springs and subterranean ecosystems. Developed by the IUCN Species Survival Commission Freshwater Conservation Committee, the motion has helped bring long overdue attention to springs and created new momentum for action. Since its adoption, Shoal and partners, including the IUCN Species Survival Commission Freshwater Conservation Committee, Rewild, the Spring Stewardship Institute, and the University of Missouri St. Louis, in collaboration with the St. Louis Zoo, have been working to translate this global commitment into tangible action on the ground. So this season on springs is a chance to raise awareness and build a shared understanding about how essential springs are to habitats, communities, and to wildlife. We kick off the season with this first session of three by giving a broad overview on the importance of springs, which features three of the world's leading experts on the subject. First up, we'll hear from Larry Stevens. Larry is the director of the Spring Stewardship Institute based in Arizona. As director of the SSI and a long-term research ecologist, Dr. Stevens has worked on aquatic ecosystems, land and water resource management, aquatic and riparian species biology, and he has provided advisement and assistance on water resource management across local to federal USA governance to multiple Native American tribes and to many NGOs and scientific colleagues. He has authored more than 150 scientific and popular publications, including books on river running in Grand Canyon, the ecology of spring and stream ecosystems, global biogeography, dragonfly ecology, poetry, and conservation. Larry's talk will give a global overview about springs, ecohydrogeology, and conservation. Next up will be Stefanie von Fumetti, a researcher at the University of Basel, Switzerland. As a passionate freshwater ecologist, Dr. von Fumetti leads a working group with a research focus on spring ecology at the University of Basel. She is mainly interested in the biodiversity and conservation of natural springs in the Alps and wants to raise the awareness of these peculiar but endangered habitats. From Larry's global to Stefanie's local, her talk will be focused on springs ecohydrogeology and conservation with an alpine perspective. And we'll then hear from Heidi van Deventer, Principal Researcher at the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research in South Africa. Dr. van Deventer is also a research associate at the University of Pretoria's Department of Geography, Geoinformatics and Meteorology. She trained as a geographer, specializing in geoinformatics, and merged this with her passion for wetlands, ecosystem, biodiversity mapping and monitoring. Heidi's talk will focus on biodiversity typing of South African springs at a countrywide scale for reporting to the Global Biodiversity Framework. A very small bit of housekeeping. Today's webinar will last between an hour and a half and 2 hours. After Larry, Stefanie, and Heidi present, we'll have the chance for a question and answer session at the end. Please feel free to introduce yourselves on the chat and say where you're dialing in from. It's always really interesting to see where in the world people are calling from. And please keep your questions coming in throughout the talks and we'll note them down and ask them at the Q&A at the end. The session is being recorded and we'll upload it to Shoal's YouTube channel and website before the weekend. That is more than enough talking from me. Larry, Stefanie, Heidi, it's absolutely fantastic to have you joining us. Thank you so much. And Larry, if you're ready to share your screen, it is over to you.
Michael, can you see the screen all right?
No, we can't actually.
Okay, one minute. Can you see the screen? See the screen now? Oops.
No,
Okay,
unfortunately not.
let me try again then. I'm sorry with the.
No, it's looking promising.
Okay.
Hopefully, yeah, we can see a screen. It doesn't look
A
like the right
screen.
screen.
One moment. Apologies for the all these
Oh, that's cool.
difficulties. Okay, back to here. Okay, uh, let's slideshow from beginning. And can you see that?
Yeah, perfect. It's looking good.
Okay.
Brilliant.
All
Thanks, Larry.
Thank you very much, and apologies for the interruption there. My name is Larry Stevens. I direct the Spring Stewardship Institute here in Flagstaff, Arizona, and I'm joined by Dr. Joseph Hallway. He's our assistant director here. Our mission is to improve understanding of springs as ecosystems rather than as hydrologic commodities, and to be able to advise folks managing springs in the best way to do so. So, springs, of course, are places where groundwater is exposed at the planetary surface, usually flowing, but not always. Their hydrogeology involves them as bottom-up, subsurface to surface linked, groundwater-dependent headwater wetland ecosystems, and hopefully that will satisfy most of the policy wonks of the audience. Very large number of words there about what these things are. But springs are recognized universally in all cultures, in all languages, and therefore really constitute at least a biome around the world. In terms of their importance, what we find is that springs are poorly mapped everywhere, but there are likely about 20 million springs on Earth or so. The biodiversity of springs is enormous and very poorly explored. Using eDNA techniques, we find thousands of springs-dependent taxa, SDT, that are microbial forms, invertebrates, fish, quite a few plants, etc. Their evolutionary and ecological functions include the development of endemism in some complex ways. Springs also function as keystone ecosystems, small patches of land in the environment that really influence the entire surrounding and adjacent uplands. Springs are also complicated because they're highly individualistic. Two springs right next to each other might not resemble each other very much. A tremendous cultural, historic, and economic significance to springs, and springs provide the base flow for most of the non-glaciated rivers on Earth. Their economics is also tremendous with subsistence, bottled water, hot springs resource, and urban water uses. Five of the European capitals rely on springs for their water sources. I'm going to focus on the U.S. here, but the theme of this talk is really global, and all of these issues that I'll talk about apply everywhere. We have some, well, first, a map of the springs that have been named in the U.S. shows that they're very patchily distributed, particularly in the montane regions. Large valleys and open floor habitats have relatively few springs. And of course, there's a lot of politics around springs. The state of Wisconsin initially decided to do an inventory, but they defined a spring as having a flow of at least 28 liters per second and at least 80% of the time, and it had to support trout. So if it didn't meet those flow or fish criteria, it was not regarded as a spring. They've since improved their appreciation for springs there. I'll talk about two states in the union that have very kind of different conditions here. So um, I'll talk about the state of Florida, which has about 1,000 or close to 1,000 large pool-forming springs that attract a lot of attention. Uh, Florida has a fairly rigorous monitoring program of its springs, and these are karstic, shallow aquifer springs with incredible economic value, ecological value, but many are contaminated by agricultural pollutants. For more information, there's an entire institute in Florida about springs, and welcome you to look at that. In contrast, in the United States, the state of Nevada is our driest state. Nevada has at least 26,000 springs, and this is a remarkable density of springs in such a dry state. But the high density is really focused on the montane areas. We have more than 150 mountain ranges in Nevada, which host most of the springs. We've inventoried about 15% of those springs in one way or another, not all full ecological inventories, but sometimes just water flow or water quality. And the mapping is pretty much dreadfully incomplete. At least 5% of the springs are new or previously unreported when we go out on field work there. In terms of the springs dependent taxa, rather enormous array of species that are endemic to springs. 83 endemic spring snails, 19 plant species, half of the fish fauna, half of the amphibian fauna, a few mammals, only one bird, the American dipper, but eDNA analyses there indicate we have hundreds to thousands of undescribed microbial springs-dependent taxa. In Nevada, we're finding that 83% of the springs have been altered, and the percentage varies by proximity to developed areas, but two-thirds of them have been significantly altered. Uh, Also of importance is that most of our recent extinctions in Nevada have been of springs-dependent species, including several fish. Groundwater is, of course, nearly entirely derived from the atmosphere. But in arid regions, it's often the case that evaporation takes away most of that precipitation. So there's not really very much water left in arid regions for infiltration. This puts such regions at great risk because intensive groundwater extraction, especially during drought and under warming climate, exacerbates groundwater withdrawal. And there's a kind of a typical example of a declining spring flow from a point in central Arizona there. In terms of background, aquifers are often stacked. And you have an aquifer aquitard kind of couplet is actually what creates the aquifer, with a fractured or porous rock being able to receive water that's infiltrating from the surface, but its downward descent stalled by an aquitard. Of course, the landscape is deeply fractured, so in many cases, then water is passing through these aquifer aquitard couplets and passing down to deeper levels. There's a tiny amount of crustal dewatering that's going on as well. 0.001% of the groundwater comes from crustal dewatering in some landscapes. But nonetheless, the springs that emerge from higher elevations are typically responding to snowmelt, and these are generally cooler water, low ion concentration sites with higher potability. When these are karstic, there's also a very high pollution potential for them because the pollutants can pass right through the aquifers and come out. At lower elevations, and for longer flow path systems, the water coming out is usually warmer because the earth is warm, it's chemically enriched, and it's got lower potability. These low elevation springs can be very challenging for life to live in. I show here a picture of a pool that contains no macro life. It contains archaea, interestingly, but no macro invertebrates or fish. So the aquifer context really shapes the way that the ecosystem can function. Here are two examples from our area in central Arizona here. Vasey's Paradise in Grand Canyon has a flow path of about 15 kilometers or so, 20 kilometers, and it responds very quickly to precipitation, as little as 18 hours. In contrast, Montezuma Well, the groundwater flows about 100 kilometers from the Colorado Plateau to this site. It's got a very lagged response to climate. Its flow duration there it may be as much as 13,300 years. That's a great deal of endemism to take place at that site. So these are very contrasting systems, and the aquifer and flow path is really determining a lot of their ecology. With my co-authors Abe Springer and Edward Shank, we've been able to identify about 12 spring types around the world. And these are we've developed a dichotomous key to these, so it provides a useful reference for understanding what spring type you're looking at here. There's a lot of discussion about how to classify springs. That discussion's been going on for a century without any resolution, and so we thought it best to just put this forth as a very simple way to understand what the structure of the ecosystem is, and therefore what life it can support. In addition to the 12 types of springs, any one spring can have a number of microhabitats, and this greatly complicates the habitat heterogeneity of a spring and allows many life forms to coexist within a single spring. So in this case, Thunder River has a cave, a wet meadow, madiculous whitewater sheets of flow, terraces, wet walls, dry walls, channel riparian pools, hyporheic flow below the floor of the channel, as well as mist zones. So the greatly complicated landscape there. This spring, which is about half a hectare in size, is occupied by the highest concentration of land snails of any spring in Arizona. 12 species of land snails occur at this spring. So it's not only the aquatic forms that rely on springs, but also the riparian forms around them. Getting into the biota of springs is really fascinating. There's four groups: the aquifer, the life that lives in the aquifers, the vegetation surrounding the spring, the invertebrates that living at springs, and the vertebrates there, as well as the fungi. So in the aquifers, you have all these kind of extremely strange, sometimes very long-lived, blind organisms that sometimes wash out into the spring. I detected a bioluminescent isopod at a spring in Big Bend National Park a few years ago that had washed out of the Edwards Aquifer. Now, in terms of the vegetation, springs host a kind of remarkable array of plant species, including upland species that move into the periphery. They might be opportunistic, and species that are clearly wetland species, some of the Salicaceae, cottonwoods and willows and whatnot. Spring species that are found only at springs, but might be widespread. This is a case of the helleborine orchid found across Western North America, but occurs in the Southwest only at springs. And then sometimes, in rare cases, highly endemic species like McDougall's flavaria here, just found at a few springs that are alkaline in the middle of Grand Canyon. The wheels on the bus fall off when it comes to invertebrate diversity at springs. Incredible array of weird life forms that live at springs and maybe entirely springs dependent. And by springs dependent, I mean that at least one life stage of the organism requires springs habitat, either aquatic or riparian, and or more than half the population lives at springs. The poster child in springs invertebrates is our spring snails for us at present. We've got about 180 species in North America, most living at 1, 2, or 3 springs. So very highly endemic fauna here. These are tiny aquatic snails, but very much restricted to springs. Globally, there might be 1,000 species or more in the Hydrobiidae. Many more species will be described in the coming decades. But that's one group of an enormous array of species of invertebrates that live at springs. When it comes to vertebrates, now we don't generally think of things like manatees as being springs dependent, but at least in the U.S., the manatees have to move from the ocean, from the coastal areas, up into freshwater springs in the winter for the warmer water. Bighorn sheep here in the Southwest, well, if they're only water sources of spring, of course, they become springs dependent. Many fish, amphibians, voles, and quite a few other creatures live at springs. But here in North America, only one bird really can be regarded as springs dependent, and that's the American dipper. So again, a wide array of species living at springs that are quite remarkable in their life history and the requirements for habitat. Speaking to shoal, of course, we need to mention fish. Once again, half the half the fish species in Nevada and a good many fish in the U.S. are springs dependent. Although fisheries biologists often don't cite that as a habitat requirement. So it'd be really wonderful to know, Michael, that for the 1,000 fish that the shoal is promoting, how many of those are actually springs dependent? What proportion of the global fish fauna is springs dependent? Springs as ecosystems, then all these species and the physical interactions that take place uh, with them got its start from Lindemann's formalization of the kind of the metrics of ecosystems, but the science of ecosystem ecology was ground truth at Silver Springs in Florida, and Odom did a fantastic job of putting that story together, identifying how much energy is transferred among trophic levels at that spring. Very few springs have been subject to this kind of analysis. And so one of the exceptions is Montezuma Well here in Arizona, where Dean Blinn has done a tremendous job of putting together that story. This is a very complicated fishless ecosystem, warm water, very much isolated from climate, a very long-lived spring system, dominated by predators that are preying on an endemic amphipod. About 7 endemic species found just in this one spring. It has the highest level of endemism of any point in North America that we know of. So putting all those stories together, springs are, are remarkably complicated systems, even though they might be small. Lots and lots of internal aquatic interactions and species going on if the spring is fully exposed to the sun, with lots of input and output of animal life coming to the spring, of litter fall coming into the spring. The spring book may be quite lengthy. Of course, respiration's going on all through it. Goods and services are transmitted downstream through that system. And the nutrient spiraling is probably fairly intense within the body of the spring, but then increasing in length as you move through the spring brook. Now, if the site is shaded, a lot of the internal productivity drops off, but there's still a lot of interaction with the landscape. Springs are remarkably important for large predators. They are ambush sites, and they have been ambush sites for predators for probably for all through evolutionary history. And that adds, sorry, to the trophic complexity and interactions with the surrounding landscape. So springs are functioning as keystone ecosystems, these very ecologically interactive points in the landscape, but the complexities are really quite enormous, and this has never actually been laid out fully in any study. Again, Odom's work at Silver Springs really focused on the aquatics, not on the overall riparian and uplands interactions that go on with those springs. Taking all that, we looked at the physical factors, the species, and the ecosystem dynamics of springs. We can look at human impacts on springs. Our evolutionary history goes back, well into the millions of years ago, 1.8 million years ago. The Olduvai Gorge springs supported hominins there. Cuthbert and Ashley did a wonderful story on that, finding that most of the bones there were found around Paleo Springs. They attributed that to human cultures retreating to springs during drought, but remembering the ambush function, those bones could be there because of either humans were using the springs as ambush points or large animals were ambushing the humans. Economics, long history in Europe, the Siloam Tunnel under Jerusalem, archaeological sites, all these contribute to the long-term importance of springs to humanity. We did a global assessment of springs conservation status. This is available on our website, springstewardshipinstitute.org, and finding that these are patterns across the world, that springs are poorly mapped, but recognized as important, vastly appropriated and impaired, vulnerable to collapse in the EU's red listed ecosystems jargon where that's been done. And the good news, though, is that the local impacts can be managed to increase ecological sustainability. However, the regional issues, of course, require policy and incentivize management opportunities and societal discussion. Overdraft of groundwater is a big deal. This really changes the flow patterns of springs, and as springs are as groundwater decreases, surface flow might be normal at first, but as it drops down, we end up with hypokrenic situations in which the groundwater is only expressed through wetland vegetation. Here's an example of a hypokrenic spring. The surface is dry, but that's wetland vegetation on the surface there. And then when springs are fully dewatered, it transitions into an upland ecosystem. And so the problem is without good mapping, we don't know when and what types of springs and species we're losing. And we want to know where groundwater management is most critical. Been quite a bit of work on groundwater decline globally. Here in the US, these red areas are places where there has been radical decline in groundwater, and of course, those are the places where the springs are most important. California is renowned for its endemic species, and that landscape is being dewatered pretty actively. They've initiated some groundwater protection there, but it hasn't really been implemented yet. 50% of the wells in the U.S. declined in level from across the last half century. A very prominent local impact on springs globally is the impacts of livestock use, and that really results in pretty devastating conditions for springs and loss of species, and really alteration of the landscape as well. Another big impact are the introduction of non-native aquatic and wetland species. Here are just a very few of the many species that show up. For some reason, people think that rather than taking their aquarium fish back to the aquarium store when they're done with having aquaria, they take them to springs and dump them in. Other species like red crayfish are now a major problem in Europe and across the U.S. being introduced into landscapes springscapes that are very prone to predator impacts. Non-native fish, non-native mollusks are also a big deal, and vegetation. So even though springs are nearly universally revered, there's a lack of effective outreach and policy. Very poor mapping, status assessment, limited ecosystem science in terms of really understanding the complexities of these systems. And at least here in the U.S., probably elsewhere, we've got a very polarized and poorly informed public. This is a shame because we've got pretty radical human impacts on springs having to do with groundwater abstraction, climate change, livestock management, etc., and recreational overuse. We didn't mention too much about the economics. Water bottling is now more than $100 billion a year globally. Much of that water is labeled as coming from springs. Springs resorts amounted to about $65 billion of revenue last year. So those are two of the many ways that springs are being used that have great economic and socioeconomic significance. Because of all this, we started the Spring Stewardship Institute to create free, secure information, archival, and management tools, protocols for inventory and assessment for anybody interested in managing springs. And we put together a database on this system that allows relational analysis of all kinds of variables that might be collected at springs, everything from water quality to biota to human use and cultural values. We've got about 1,600 users on the Springs Online database, springsdata.org, and right now we've got about 160,000 springs in the database. And so we're continuing to add to this. The more people that add to it, of course, the more robust the relational analyses can be. We use that information to generate recommendations for managers. We use those recommendations to do a restoration at a site called Big Spring in northern Arizona here a couple of years ago. And within 7 months, we by fencing the site and protecting it from the thousands of sheep that had been grazing the site was transferred from a very low biodiversity to such a noisy environment that you couldn't really hear yourself think due to all the pollinators that were coming into the site. So the good news here is that with a little bit of attention, springs can be managed in a way that's very productive and inexpensive and practical. because everyone wants their springs to be flowing. So what we recommend here is improved mapping, understanding the status of springs, especially rare spring types at every nation, better understanding of the ecology, the biodiversity, and valuation of the springs, uh, developing a secure relational collaborative information management system like Springs Online can be done for any country. And that's what we're proposing through this IUCN Springs Task Force that Michael mentioned. We need more outreach among scientific disciplines because hydrologists typically don't think about the ecology and ecologists don't really understand the hydrology. We need to communicate to the public and to policymakers to secure better funding and rehabilitation methods for springs. So happy to take any questions perhaps after this set of sessions is over, but what's good for springs is good for all things. Thank you very much.
What a lovely way to end the talk, Larry. Thank you. What's good for springs is good for all things. And it was really heartening to see the big stream restoration. It's amazing to see how ecosystems can bounce back when given the chance. You asked, that was a really great talk. Thank you. Thank you so much, Larry. You asked about how many shoal priority fishes, and thanks for dropping that question. How many of them are springs dependent? I've been reliably informed by Grace Brady, our data officer, that there are 167 currently out of the 2,507 current active priority fishes, which is around 7%. So yeah, you can really see how essential they are to lots of creatures, including priority species. And I was going to take all questions at the end, but Jan Graf did ask something that's probably worth answering now. Jan says, I note the definition of springs. Do you distinguish springs from seeps? And if so, how would you define the difference?
Yeah, so seeps are springs, but they typically have unmeasurable flow. You can see the soil is moist. You're only monitoring kind of approach there might be the wetted area, but a seep is simply a small spring.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And next up, we have Stefanie. We need to try and find how we stop sharing your screen, Larry,
Yeah,
and then pull up Stefanie's screen.
very good. Well,
Oh,
Oh,
that
it's looking
worked.
good.
great.
Thanks so much, Larry. In the practice session a few minutes before we started, we had a lot of trouble stopping sharing screens. So fortunately, those tech issues have been ironed out.
So you see my screen?
Yeah,
Perfect. Okay.
great.
Okay, welcome everybody to my talk. It's nice to have this follow-up talk to Larry once. Well, you will see that we essentially tell the same story, but I dig a bit deeper and go back from this global scale to a more regional scale. So I will go mainly to the Alps, but it's also about geodiversity of springs, the threats they are confronted with, and also in the end, I will also talk about conservation actions. So first, after a short introduction, I will talk about mainly biodiversity, but also ecodiversity of springs and biogeographical aspects. Then I will talk about threats, so these anthropogenic impacts, which are very, very obvious in springs. And then in the end, as I said, Larry did also, I will talk about conservation. I have to. Oh, okay. So first of all, some words about the peculiarities of natural springs. As Larry already said, we have very restricted systems. I talk about ecotones, not ecosystems, because you can also say that springs are in between the groundwater and superficial water on the one hand. On the other hand, they are also in between the aquatic and the terrestrial interface. So they are just in between. So they are not restricted ecosystems, but more like ecotones. And at least in the Alps, in the mountainous regions, they are often very small. So they are island-like habitats, very few square meters mostly. They are also relatively stable concerning the environmental conditions. So you see that in a minute concerning the water temperature, but also the discharge, for example, everything in comparison to reaches upper downstream. They are usually nutrient poor habitats if they are not impacted by nutrient input by humans or cattle. And they are, as already Larry mentioned, rich in many different microhabitats. This, of course, forces the water and enlarges the biodiversity, of course. So this ecotonal character that you have groundwater species as well as running water species, but also species restricted to springs enhances biodiversity, but also this microhabitat diversity. We find granobiontic species, so spring specialists, as well as those species which are also occur in the spring brook, for example. Lots of endemics already. Larry already mentioned these snails. We also have them in Europe, of course. But on the other hand, they are also very threatened, these species, owing to the high risk potential for springs in general, for spring habitats. And now I want to illustrate what is meant when we talk about stability. That's a spring I monitor since 6 years now, since 2019. It's in the Swiss Alps, in the Swiss National Park, and that's the water temperature I analyze or log with temperature loggers in hourly, and you see that the median from 2019 to 2024 only differs slightly. It's about 6.8 to 7.2 degrees. And even the minimum and maximum temperatures differ only slightly. So it's from 6.5 up to 7.8 degrees all over these 5 years I recorded here. So this is very, very stable. And also concerning other physicochemical parameters, if you think of electrical conductivity, pH, and so on, they are really stable. Of course, they show a certain seasonal variability, but that's not much. And besides that, also the discharge is relatively stable. We see the impact of the snow melt in early spring, and we see that the discharge decreases slightly during summer, but that's not much essentially. And talking about spring specialists, it's nice to see that in other regions of the world, we also have fish, for example. We don't have them in I would say, not in Europe at all. And of course, not in the Alps. We have mainly spring specialists among our dipterans. So there's an example among the soldier flies. The genus Oxycera is all over restricted to springs. Then among the caddisflies, there are a lot of spring specialists. Here, this one, this Chronoetia edorata, this guy is, in Germany, say that this is our spring caddisfly, just occurring in springs. And of course, the water mites, they have a high share of spring specialists, as we will see later on. And before we dig a bit deeper in the biodiversity and biogeography of springs, I think I should show you a map of Europe where you can see our mountain ranges. So mainly the Alps, of course, in the middle of everything, but there are also the Pyrenees. And here the red stars, they indicate sites where a lot of spring research happened or spring monitoring happened in the last year. So it's mainly in northern Italy, in Austria, but also in Germany, and of course also in Switzerland. The main monitoring programs or research was done in the Bernese Alps, and I'm mostly active in the most eastern part of Switzerland in Grisons, in the most eastern canton where the Swiss National Park and the surrounding biosphere reserve is. So I have the opportunity to work and do research in a IUCN 1A restricted reserve, which is really great, but I'm also in this unique situation that I have really pristine, very, very pristine springs there. So, what I also wanted to say, you might recognize that the Pyrenees and the Alps are oriented from the east to the west, or from horizontally, you can say. This is also important for the distribution of our spring species or species in general. So these mountain ranges functioned as barriers during the Pleistocene. And afterwards, it was not so easy to recolonize Europe again. So this is also true for all plants and many, many other vertebrates, for example. And this is also a reason why, especially the Balkan region, which was a refuge during the Pleistocene, but also the Carpathians, which were more easier colonized, are one of the biodiversity hotspots, especially also for springs. Now I want to show you some illustrations, some photographs of typical springs we find in the higher regions of the Alps. So they are all above the tree line. The tree line is at about 2,000 meters above sea level. You see that all these ones are very steep, so it's often in steep areas. They are therefore often fast flowing. We don't have much organic substrates, many stones and pebbles, but a lot of moss surrounding them or inside them, and they're often very cold. So if I talk about very cold, I mean it's about 5 degrees. And this one in the middle, this is a very special one, which it has about 2.5 degrees all over the year. So this is very cold, and I guess that it's also, or it is also influenced by permafrost in the surroundings. Now I want to show you two different examples. So I don't talk about the typology at all, but Larry mentioned the limnocrenes in his talk. And this is one very special limnocrene in the Swiss National Park. You see this blue color. So it's a very oligotrophic, relatively large limnocrene. And it's quite special because it has an extremely high electrical conductivity and sulfide concentration. And this obviously comes from an aquifer which flows through a gypsum layer. And this is why you have such high sulfide concentration. And this is, of course, not so habitable. And we have a lot of oxygen, iron oxide, and it's a brownish layers. And what we also have is low or almost no oxygen in this pool, but also at the outflow. There's, I don't know, maybe 4 microgram per liter oxygen at the outflow of this spring. And nevertheless, we have stoneflies, planarians, chironomids in high abundances, even in those very difficult conditions. So this is quite special about this spring. And another one, which is special because it's really large in comparison to all our very small ones. It's actually an alluvial spring, so there's a small river in which this spring enters then, but it has many outflows. I would say at least four. I think they are there are more than four outflows. And not every of this outflow comes from the alluvium, but also from the surrounding mountains. So here on the right side. This spring has a very high, but also relatively variable discharge in comparison to other sites. And we also see a certain input of nitrate. This is because of we have livestock near this spring, and also there's the main road through the national park, and also a small restaurant. So there's a certain input of pollution into this spring. However, this spring is rich in moss carpets, as you can see nicely on this picture. We have a lot of water mites, planarians again, and very, very high abundances again of chironomids here. So now I want to talk a little bit about the spring specialists. First, the water mites. So as I already said, there are a lot of water mites really bound to the spring or restricted to spring habitats, and it's said that at least 40% of all known European water mite species are crinobiontic, so spring specialists. And I guess there are even more when you think of all those in the southeastern part of Europe, where not the whole diversity is already described. And we did a study a few years ago where we looked at the water mite diversity genetically, and my former PhD detected 7 new species via genetic interspecific distances larger than 5.6. So some of them are really easy to distinguish actually morphologically. So these two Patnunia species A and B, they are about to describe them. Some others are not easily to describe them or to distinguish morphologically, but yes, they are different species. So there's a lot of hidden diversity within these water mites, but they are really, really tiny and not easy to identify. You cut them into half, and it's not easy to do that with a species or a specimen which is just 1 millimeter diameter. And the caddisflies are very important in Europe. I didn't see them on Larry's slide when he talked about the invertebrate diversity, especially within the genus Drusus. We have many, many endemic species, microendemic species. And it said that within this genus, 75% are endemic to one or few mountain ranges. And again, the diversity is highest in the Balkan region, in the Carpathians, and we have more than 170 species of Drusus, and most of them are not described as larvae. And here's an example of 2 species, Drusus alpinus and Drusus franci. Those have a very restricted geographical range. So those Drusus alpinus is restricted to the Western Alps, while Drusus franci is restricted to the very Eastern Alps. And this is most probably really due to these ice ages, where really the ice ages formed our landscapes, and we also have to see that the distribution patterns of our endemic species is most probably also formed by the Pleistocene, and it's assumed that those species survived the ice ages in extra-Mediterranean refugia, most probably at the southern edge or the southeastern edges of the Alps, and then re-entered the Alps again during diversification. So a high diversity and a high endemism within this genus of caddisflies. You've seen these guys already in Larry's talk, so the hydrobead snails. We also have them in Europe, and I want to point out This genus Butinella, where we have 5 different species in Germany now. And you would say they all look quite the same, but they're really distinct species, and again, very small, smaller than 2 millimeters. But those small scale endemic species do also have the advantage if you think of awareness raising. We just invented a small or a digital nature trail for springs in the Black Forest. So that's just here around the corner of Switzerland. And we use this species, Butinella badensis, which just occurs just right there in the southern Black Forest as a mascot, you can say. And this digital nature trail really helps us to promote springs, promote the different usages of springs as drinking water, but also the ecosystem services. And this is done in this context of education for sustainable development. And for this, it's really good to have these, it's actually a small umbrella species or flagship species for our springs up there. And last but not least, high biodiversity. There's also a huge hidden diversity within the dipterans. I guess you are aware that dipterans as larvae are not easy to identify, and many of our monitoring efforts are focusing on those EPTs, so Ephemeroptera, the mayflies, the Plecopterans, the stoneflies, and the Trichopterans, the caddisflies. And they are, of course, easier to identify. And we started a few years ago to, besides the classical monitoring or sampling, we also do eDNA sampling. And if we compare those groups and the techniques in my site, I monitor in the Swiss National Park. You see, when you look at these 3 groups, that's more or less similar, the species numbers you find. So caddisflies, 18 with eDNA and 23 with classical sampling. But with classical sampling, you can't identify the chironomids further. So we don't do it. Of course, you can, but we don't do it. It's far too much effort for us to identify the chironomids further. But if you then have a look at the eDNA data, see that we have more than 74 species within just 22 springs. So there is a lot. And focusing on this large spring I showed you before, that's just the eDNA data. And we see that we found 6 water species, 5 Plecopterans, and 2 caddisflies. That's okay, and that's all more or less the number of species we found classically. And then if we go to the chironomids, we found with eDNA, we find 23 species. So that's far more species than for the classical monitoring taxa. So there's a large hidden diversity, and this is something we also have to consider for the future. Okay, but now I also have to talk about the anthropogenic impacts. So the typical impacts we find in general, it's mainly the drinking water issue. Everybody knows that we all want to have clear, cold drinking water, and this is how it is also advertised. The fountains everywhere. When you go hiking, they have these rimmed springs everywhere for drinking water. They also drain the meadows for the livestock. So we have a lot of damaged springs, but we also have these aspects that the springs, that we have holy springs, such this one in Lourdes, where we see that they are thought to have healing forces, for example. And sometimes they are just not recognized as springs. They're damaged, full of rubbish and polluted, and it's a phenomenon of eutrophication you also just see. And they also sometimes just vanish because of that the groundwater gets rimmed, and the layer of the groundwater fell, and we don't have springs anymore. So many impacts, and they are in the Alps. It's mainly the cattle, so the livestock, which is problematic. Besides this mechanical stress, also Larry showed pictures of this trampling. We of course have the input of nutrients, nitrate, ammonia, and so on. We also have water abstraction, so there are a lot of stressing factors for those springs. And if you look at this picture, you see everything in one picture. You see erosion, you see eutrophication, you see the trampling, you see water abstraction. This is really problematic, and this is an example of a nature park. So it's not strictly protected, but it's a nature park. So even a protection status does not have to protect springs, actually. And another threat which came up in the last years is, of course, climate change. How do springs and springbrooks react to climate change, and especially in the Alps? So it's I would say quite clear that we will have a strong influence on aquatic biodiversity in the Alps. So this is predicted, and it's already going on. But we still don't know how springs and springbrooks will react to that, because, as I said in the beginning, they are quite stable ecosystems, ecotones, and if they change, so that's a real sign that all ecosystems will change in the long term. And this is what I actually am mostly doing in the Swiss National Park. So I started a long-term monitoring, and I want to see how climate change influences the springs and their brooks in the Alps. And I want to see if we have any changes in the water temperature or the discharge regime. Do we see that the input of meltwater decreases, for example? Do we, in accordance, see any shifts of the species assemblages, or do we see shifts in the longitudinal zonation patterns? Do we see that generous species, for example, climb upstream, enter the streams at higher altitudes, for example? And I would say at the moment, I do not see any trend in these springs I monitor since 2019. But we had the opportunity in the Swiss National Park to compare springs which were first sampled in the 1930s. It's just 4 springs, but it's what was anyway nice to compare these 4 concerning their biophysical chemistry and also their faunistic assemblages. And here is an idea, so it wasn't just a bachelor thesis, but anyway, very nice results. And you see this shift. So in red, we have these assemblages from 1937, and then in 2024, we have a shift partly to more generalist species of obviously climbing upstream, entering the spring brook, not necessarily the spring itself, so not the upper 10 meters, but they were 100 meters below the spring. And on the other hand, we've seen no changes in the ecomorphology. It was really easy to find the springs. We've seen no warming at all. It was essentially the other way around. The springs cooled, so we can discuss later on why this was the case. But we've seen really this shift towards generalists. So last but not least, a couple of words about conservation of springs in Europe. As an example, Switzerland and Germany, because I obviously worked there. And in Switzerland, we are quite far in mapping and evaluating our springs. It's mainly nature parks, but actually mostly every canton is active. And in Switzerland, springs are part of this action plan biodiversity strategy of the Federal Office of the Environment. But we have to say that springs are actually not legally protected. So every owner can do with its spring whatever he wants. In Germany, springs are legally protected. That's good. But however, they still get rimmed or used for drinking water. And we have quite large regional differences concerning activities such as monitoring or evaluation, restoration, and so on. So there are many activities, for example, in Bavaria. So they invented their first assessment methods in the 90s. They do a lot of revitalization, fencing, and so on, and a lot of for awareness raising. But we have this problem that springs and spring brooks are still not included in the European Water Framework Directive. That's really problematic. But we're still quite active. We do have a working group, Springs and Groundwater, which is associated to the German Limnological Society. We have yearly meetings, joint publications, joint conferences. We have these assessment tools we apply in Switzerland and Germany and try to improve them together. So this is quite nice. And I want to share with you just one example of such an ecomorphological assessment in Switzerland. So this is in a nature park, and this was a master's thesis, and you see that the blue dots are natural springs, so no impacts of cattle and so on, and the red ones are damaged. And in this nature park, we see really that the all springs below 1,500 meters are really impacted mainly by livestock, but also by other human activities such as drinking water supply. And the higher you get, the larger gets the share of natural springs. So this region, Alp Tumbrief, Alp Ana Rosa, these are the highest ones, and there they are the most natural ones. And lastly, there are also other monitoring actions in the Alps in different countries. So in Germany, mostly in the National Park Berchtesgaden, there were 300 springs documented and over 150 sampled faunistically. We have in Austria, we also have actions in the National Park Gesäuse, where over 900 springs were documented and sampled. And also in Italy, I mentioned it in the beginning, there is a lot going on, especially with diatoms and Marco Cantonati. And they also published, for example, a handbook for sampling methods, which is quite good. So in the end, there's a lot to do for future projects and maybe potential goals for us for the future. Thinking of potential of future projects. What about assessment of risk potential? What about the drying or desiccation of springs and the temperature increase? How can we assess that? How can we maybe develop forest management strategies for springs which are in the forests? Can we react to the drying with forest management, for example? And for European goals would be really, really good to have a standardized sampling protocol for Europe, standardized spring assessment tools. So there's not a lot going on in other countries. And lastly, the consideration of springs and headwaters in general would be in the Water Framework Directive would be really, really helpful and one goal for policy actions. And internationally, yeah, we need a platform for continuous exchange. Maybe also on this level, standardized spring assessment tools, and also this consideration of springs as threatened habitat ecosystems, as Larry already mentioned. With this, I'm at the end. I thank you for your attention and feel free to have a look at our Spring Ecology Instagram account. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stefanie. And it's really wonderful to be whisked away to these magical places, as Mike said in the chat. It's really enjoyable seeing those photos. Just very quickly, is there any movement to get springs considered in the European Water Framework Directive or to have legal protection in Switzerland? Yeah, what sort of steps are being taken, if any, at the moment?
Yes. So I'm very reluctant, but I would say that we at the moment we have the right momentum to do something to and we are just inventing a project with different countries all over Europe, and we need this shared policy actions to do this step. But the Water Framework Directive itself is still so complicated, and so other countries are also reluctant to open it up to the headwaters. So that's a big step, and yeah, I'm not so confident that this will happen. And for Switzerland, mm, yeah, I don't think so that this will happen. There are some. Um, they just try to have some springs of national importance, for example. So this is a good step, but I don't think there will a legal protection in the next years. So we have this federal. There are many cantons. Every canton has different interests, so that's the difficulty in the policy in Switzerland.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah, I understand. Thank you. And Kate Snadden has asked in the chat, is there microplastic pollution in the high altitude springs in the Alps? Has it made its way up there?
Not that I know, but we did not look inside yet. So, but if I look at my samples with 200 micrometer mesh, so I don't see any microplastics, no.
Oh wow. Well,
Around Basel,
that's
yes, but not there.
yeah, okay. Well, that's reassuring. It must be one of the only places in the world
Yeah.
that doesn't have. It's at the top of Mount Everest and in the bottom of the Mariana Trench, isn't it? So if it's not in the
No, I
high
wouldn't think
altitude
so.
springs in the Alps, that's
No,
that's a real win.
no.
Okay, thank you so much. That was really
Welcome.
interesting. Heidi, are you ready to present?
Yes, I'm ready, present. But if I may ask, can you remove that clone of mine that's coming in?
Yeah.
I was
You would,
wondering who
you
this
would,
was.
yeah, you would imagine that the clones are very useful. But yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks, Heidi.
Can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Thank you very much, everybody, for this opportunity where we can start sharing our thoughts that we had on how we would approach biodiversity typing at a desktop scale for South Africa, and whether this is possible for reporting to the Global Biodiversity Framework by 2030. I would like to give recognition to my co-authors, Dr. Christa Hansen from University of Pretoria. She's also a geometician like me, and Dr. Nicolette Vermaak from the CSIR, a colleague, and Mr. Farnes Fourie from Department of Water and Sanitation, who are geohydrologists. And it's been a wonderful journey, and thanks for their organizations also. So we recognize, like the other authors and people, that the springs are a separate ecosystem type that needs to be distinguished from rivers and wetlands in the reporting. And fortunately, this is also recognized by the global ecosystem typology that is being used for reporting to the global biodiversity framework. So just as a reminder that under Goal A, all ecosystem reporting is being done with loss, but implicitly illustrates that we need to illustrate what the biodiversity of the springs are. Target 2 is then saying that 30% of the extent of degraded ecosystems should be under restoration by 2030. And target 3 is about 30% of each type should be under protection. So the red listing of ecosystems is done in a bottom-up approach by countries where they use level 3 and 4 of the typology. So here on the right-hand side, you can see the typology where the top 3 layers is defining the biodiversity of an ecosystem, first through the realms, then the biomes, and then thirdly through the functional groupings. Whereas layers 4 to 6 is about the regional context within which they occur. And this is where there's a lot of discussion still about what can be considered at level 4, 5, and 6. And you can see from the green lines that level 4 is separate from level 5. And level 5 is looking at the global typology with a subset of subglobal types at level 6. So let's look at the consideration also that we don't think springs are only associated with the freshwater realm. You can see currently in the global ecosystem types on the right-hand side, 2 ecosystem types are being considered for springs and springs reporting. The first one is F2.8, artesian springs and oases, and the second one, F2.9, geothermal pools and wetlands. But these are only associated with the freshwater ecosystems, whereas we as authors think that it should be a transitional realm between the freshwater realm and the subterranean realm. So even if we look at what the possible diversity is that we can get at level 3 from the existing classifications such as Kirk-Bryan in 1919 or that of what Larry presented to you all, there's a great diversity in the detail that one can use potentially at level 3, more than what's currently captured at the global ecosystem type. So on the left-hand side, you can see this classification system of 1990 already identifies 28 types, whereas Larry's grouping gives 6 lotic and 6 lentic sites. But both of these approaches require really in-field validation and even subsurface characterization of springs, which is absolutely fantastic. But the challenge is that we don't always have the time and cost to undertake this in the field. So another thing that we've been brainstorming is also that we don't see a consistent characterization and all the details that's possible at level 3 of all the aquatic ecosystem types. So for example, currently the lakes are considered the substance, whether it's water, salt, or soda, but those for springs are not considered at all. Hydroperiod is considered, or the seasonality, permanent, seasonal, or episodic, or ephemeral. And then depths are not always considered for the lakes and the springs, like the lakes, whether they're limnetic or littoral. And the temperatures is basically just a categorization of geothermal and not any subcategories. Then for rivers and springs, flow and yield is recognized, and the substrate is sometimes recognized, for example, peats, but the others weren't considered. So now if you look at the combination of 3 and 4, for ecosystem typing and red listing of these ecosystems for the IUCN, the question is also, what is really characterizing diversity to identify red listed ecosystems, whether they're unique or range restricted or under pressure? So there, level 4 becomes important to consider both the regional context, whereas level 3 needs to also reflect the characteristics of these systems towards red listing, what is unique and range restricted. So just to repeat myself again. However, many of the systems we need to evaluate at continental to global scales to understand which of those are across different country boundaries, and therefore a top-down approach with the use of level 5 and 6 become really important to say, well, maybe certain rivers, wetlands, or springs occur at a regional scale, but are still unique and range restricted, and therefore more than one country would become responsible for managing the range restricted systems. So therefore, in our view, we said that at level 4, what could be useful for springs in their typing is considering aquifer type, so recognizing also what is subsurface and not what you can type just from the above in the microhabitats. But alternatively, we need to start exploring how sensitive, like Stefanie has also mentioned it, some systems may be more sensitive because they're montane, there's no refugia where anything can migrate to, and that changes on the climate change, whereas coastal is also completely different pressures for coastal development. And then what is maybe grouping all of us at level 5 would be the primary climatic zones, whether it's tropical, temperate, arid, or polar, but the subdivision of that can go into the detailed climatic regions, say, for instance, from the Köppen-Geiger Climatic Atlas. So we try to test the scenarios and the opportunities, what is possible. So we don't have the final answers yet, but we took all the South African data sets, and you can see we had 23 data sets, of which 14 came from the Department of Water and Sanitation, totaling almost 60,000. But there were duplicated points because it wasn't a relational database. It was the same coordinate, but 2 different time surveys that was done. So one of the key steps in our merging and clipping to South Africa was then to dissolve the data sets, also if they are reported in any of the other data sets. But this integration hasn't been done yet. And so on the right-hand side, you can see the output after the dissolve showed that we've got 24,833 for the country, but you can also see in parts, there's a high density that's been recorded through certain focused projects. And there's no consistency across the country yet. Even though there's arid parts or not, we still think that there's an improvement needed, and it would be way above the 30,000 mark then for the number of springs. So for our reporting year and our consideration, we said we first want to calculate what is the possible number of springs combining the different levels. What is it that we found through applying it to the data set? And then we indicate these as percentages, especially for those that are dominating out of this total of 24,833 number of springs. So when we apply the ecosystem typology of the global ecosystem typology to level 3, where they only distinguish 2, we said on the left-hand side, how can we ensure it's maybe artesian, even though we know some of them may be gravitational? But we said anything within 5 meters from the 1 to 50,000 streams and river map that's shown on the left-hand side could be associated with artesian, as well as anything occurring within the polygons of the National Wetland Map 6 that was compiled by the South African National Biodiversity Institute and is still in the process of being updated. But our findings showed that 88% of the springs wasn't typed because they weren't close to any of these 2 data sets, and also not being geothermal. On the right-hand side, there's only 68 points that was integrated from 4 data sets, and that totals only 0.3% of all the springs. So then we had to, sorry, I think I skipped a slide somewhere, sorry. Sorry, people, let me just go. No, I did discuss the different levels of 3. So now we're applying those levels here and asking ourselves in the data set that we've collected, how many data attribute values is available for level 3 typing that we envisaging to be consistent across the ecosystem types? How can we refine the typology for reporting of biodiversity to the global biodiversity framework? So only the 2 that's listed in blue showed attribute values for some of the systems, but none of the others were available, not for substance, hydroperiod, depth, or substrate. Less than 10% of the points had some hydroperiod information, but it was not consistent. So when we look at the temperature classes, there are actually 4 temperature classes that was documented by Kent in 1949, giving the thresholds of these as they occur in South Africa. And you can see we can do this division, but again, we are not certain whether we need to divide it even further. I see Stefanie's temperatures are around 6-7%. You know, we haven't tested ours in the lower thresholds and see whether we should actually improve it beyond what Kent has said, anything below 25 degrees is cold. So it is also not, we don't have the data for all 24,833 classes, and therefore it's maybe not such a solid variable to use for the typing. We have 5 classes for the yield, but it's combined with the aquifer types, and it's more on the level of 4 then, regional attributes of these systems, as opposed for individual systems that were measured, and that we can get an understanding of the true contribution or distribution and ranges of these systems. But for level 4, we have this from the Department of Water and Sanitation. They have mapped the aquifer types. They recognize 6 aquifer types with 5 yield classes to this, and it's definitely available at a desktop level that we can test. At levels 5 to 6, as I've mentioned, we want to then do a top-down assessment to see, do we have maybe systems that is unique across the globe, across these primary climatic zones. In South Africa, we've got only 3 regions, the tropical region, however, we call it the subtropical region, and then we have the temperate and the arid regions. On the right-hand side, you can actually see that we've got 11 refined systems from the Koppen-Geiger dataset that we can use and apply. So yes, we've tested and applied it, and here is the summary table with the first 2 columns listing the possibilities of using and applying the global ecosystem typology. Let me take you through the first argument. So there's only 2 types that is possible in brackets for level 3 with this approach. And yes, we have typed 2 of these. 2 types occur then, those that are geothermal and those that are associated with the artesian wetlands and rivers. If you start combining it now with the aquifer types, there's a possibility of 46 types. However, when you then start combining it with the global types, it reduces to 6. And then if you take it down to the detailed climatic regions, it goes to 22. But again, we have just the variability when you start applying these, they don't always occur in all of these combinations. So even if you take in column 2, the combination where you can distinguish which are associated with streams or rivers from those that are distinguished from wetlands, it's still more or less the same ranges of possibilities. And again, we just don't feel that it's capturing the biodiversity of the systems. And also because 88% of the systems aren't typed this way, we just say we don't think this is a feasible approach for South Africa's consideration. On the right-hand side, therefore, we said, why don't we bring in a possible approach where you combine aquifer types, yield, and the climatic regions in column 3. And then in column 4, you can consider temperature classes as well. So again, with the fact that we, in the last column, see that only 1% of the springs have temperature classes, we also don't think that would be a valuable approach, and therefore recommend for consideration and further stakeholder engagement, this one in column 3. And we really like the combinations that is possible at level 5 for a global assessment, as well as those that can be used then and considered for desktop typing and a start for South Africa, where we have manifested 128 types of the 330 possible types. So the outputs then are shown here on the left-hand side. You can see that there's a dominance of 2 classes. One class, the green one, is dominating those areas, especially where the project did fine-scale capturing of the data. And it's almost 50% of all the springs. And whereas many of the classes have such a fine, less than 10% percentage representation, that it becomes challenging in having to go and validate in the field whether these are really different from one another. However, when we start combining 3, 4, and 6, so it's the yield, the aquifer types, and then the detailed climatic regions, we see that the number of classes, so this is out of the total of 128 ecosystem types, the dominance is breaking up into more representative classes. That could be good. However, if you now have to go and validate 10% of each of the 125 classes, it still is challenging and costly and time-consuming to go and do that. Transformation, I'm very glad that Larry and Stefanie have given you a good overview of the impacts. We have similar ones, especially the hot springs are a tourist site where people are enjoying themselves. And even if they start creating taps in the rural areas for people to have ease with the household use of these water for the household use, the challenge remains that is the transformation to a tap impactful or an opportunity to actually better measure the flow and changes in the flow because of water abstraction, and can you put a water meter to it? But as you can see, you can't just use remote sensing to really evaluate these. You would have to do in-field validation of your impacts and the extent and severity of the pressures. Let's look at protection levels. So here we combined the first option where we combine level 3, 4, and 5 with those areas that overlap in our protected areas. So that covers just a total of 7%, whereas we have also mapped strategic water source areas for groundwater systems and those for surface water systems. And you can see from the darker blue, it makes a significant contribution if there is legislation and stakeholder engagement about how to actually manage the springs in the groundwater strategic water source areas. And that principle still applies even if you look at the 128 types. There's only one ecosystem type that's actually then not protected at all in the middle, whereas you can see the strategic water source areas, both the groundwater and surface water, can make a bigger contribution. Here, the protected areas cover only 11% of the number of the ecosystem types to a maximum of only 50% of a system's ecosystem types being covered. Monitoring at the moment of flow and water quality of the springs are not done for 98% of the springs. Historically, 2% was part of a monitoring framework. But that hasn't always been persisting because of cost cutting. And currently we estimate that only 50% or 0.2% are actively being monitored, but it's not clear for which water quality attributes or the yield at all. And on the right-hand side, you can see it's also not equally distributed across all the ecosystem types or the country. And it was interesting that Nicolette Vermaak showed me the photograph of one of our very hot springs. I think it's more than 60 degrees. The equipment burned at Brandvlei and was damaged, and therefore a consideration needs to be given for how do we actually monitor certain temperature ranges of springs. So another question is, what is unique and range restricted that can be potentially considered for level 3 or for red listing of the ecosystems? So just based on counts, you can see our karst systems may be considered to be unique because they cover less than 1% of all springs currently mapped. Those on the coast, there's a picture from Varnesferie at bottom left as well, where you can't really see it very well, but there are systems that actually exit directly on beaches. And are they unique? So again, here we have very few, 4.3%, but spring mires, as being documented in this paper of Jan Groothans, those are not well mapped. And sometimes they're also not accurately mapped by different people from around the systems and not from the exact systems, and whether they are collective or linear. And those attributes need to be then better captured. Geothermal ones, as I've mentioned, is also less than 1%. But again, stakeholder engagement is important to take this forward. So yes, the key findings from this initial research study is that we do think we can start working with desktop typing of springs ecosystems across the globe, and that we can start considering how do we want to report it to target 1, whereas we are a bit not optimistic that we would be able to do proper reporting to target 2 and 3. It is maybe sometimes the system is also structurally damaged, and then it is. But how would you test it? You need your in-field validation of the subsurface condition. And so a lot of more work is really necessary in order to report this better. A lot of the data also require cleanup. Some of them were still sink dams in the arid areas and not really springs. It needs to be captured more consistently. and also the representation of linear features around fault lines where you have springs that occur in a line feature or a polygon area. Whereas we do think that the 3D in-field validation can be costly to do, but perhaps this startup data set can help South Africa in identifying where do they need to go and do such sampling in order to validate whether the microhabitats are very different subsurface and on the surface. So at the moment, we have legislation that guides all reporting of hydrological data sets, but the springs haven't been recognized yet, and there's not a coordinating committee and related government stakeholders and conservation agencies appointed to contribute to an effective relational database. We also think that knowledge co-production is very important, and we hope that lots of people are inspired to continue with the research, but we also hope that someone can maybe develop a citizen science app. And yes, not many people reach into the rivers or the wetlands and maybe the springs, but yes, we have lots of hikers, and hopefully they can contribute to better mapping of these springs, their characteristics similar to INAT. So thank you very much, everybody. I hope that you have nice questions for me, please.
Thank you so much, Heidi. That's a really interesting insight. There haven't been any questions coming in on the chat, but please do rack your brains and use this opportunity to ask Heidi, Stefanie, and Larry any of the burning springs questions you may have. In the meantime, I have a few questions of my own. Heidi, you're obviously an expert on South African springs. What do you consider to be one of the key pressures from a broad overview on South African springs?
Yeah, Michael, more than 72% of the extent of South Africa is arid, and our rainfall is extremely variable. So we have decadal droughts, phases that are actually natural hydrological cycles. And during those times, a lot of people would go into groundwater reserves and starting to extract that. And also because of the unreliable and irregular flow, there's a lot of interbasin transfers to areas where development has taken place. So one of my questions is always, if we have to start reporting on restoration for rivers, wetlands, and springs in an arid country like ours, the 30% of the degraded ecosystem is actually the aquifer volume. And who would ever then restore 30% of those volumes that has been abstracted already? So that has influenced the groundwater dependent ecosystem where there is a reduction in the flow. So a priority for South Africa is to start mapping and monitoring where did we have over abstraction and where do we see a decline in groundwater similar to what Larry has shown. And can we prioritize those areas for mapping the springs, their fauna, their flora, to understand what do we need to implement for improved monitoring, reporting, and restoration. Yeah.
Brilliant. And I assume, Stefanie, that over abstraction maybe isn't such a pressing concern in the high Alps, I guess, because there's so much water up there, so much rain. But this may be a silly question, but with the water bottling industry, to what extent does that put any pressure on springs? You know, everywhere you see spring water, does that cause any pressure on spring ecosystems and habitats?
That's a good question. No, no, I wouldn't think that's the major issue when it goes for water abstraction. It's more maybe the tourist industry as a whole. Thinking of skiing areas, for example, going further up and need the water, and also the spring water for the snow cannons. That's a problem. Or also new houses, flats for tourists, which also need maybe spring water. So there's a lot of things going on around this tourist industry, but also, yeah, water abstraction in general is a problem. Maybe not in the higher Alps, but in Switzerland, of course. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. And Larry, how about the pressures in the States? I assume in the many different sort of ecosystems in the States would have very wide, broad, sort of threats.
Yeah, our state system controls water, the water law. So each state has its own set of water laws. These are not consistent across the states. Only a few of our states have what could anything that could be described as a springs monitoring program. Florida, Wisconsin, uh, a little bit in New York. But states in the Southwest where the water is the most valued commodity often don't have springs inventory programs. California is doing a moderately good job, but none in many of the other states. So the pressures are highly varied. We find everywhere, though, both in humid areas as well as arid areas, that groundwater extraction, overdraft, as is a regional effect. Our central Great Plains, for example, the Oglala Aquifer is being literally dewatered, leaving no future for any kind of agriculture in many of those landscapes. That's a huge problem. Everywhere at a local level, livestock impacts and water abstraction for domestic use is a big deal. Pretty much every farm in the eastern U.S. is founded on a spring, just as all the towns in southern France are founded on springs. But those are places where the springs have been replaced by wells or just simply neglected in those landscapes. So the pressures vary by state. They vary because of policies, and there are very inconsistent policies protecting either groundwater or springs. And then the local and regional impacts are coupling, and climate change is a big driver of this.
Interesting, thank you. And in the sort of montane regions in particular, Stefanie and Larry, how is climate change and in particular melting permafrost affecting the flow of springs?
Stefanie, go ahead.
Yes, so I think at the moment the melting permafrost really has a stabilizing effect. So I showed this small study with this PSC study from the Swiss National Park where the temperatures rather declined than increased, and there are permafrost fields, and we assume, and we've seen that from hydrochemical measurements, that the permafrost fields are influencing the springs, and maybe this melting permafrost is currently stabilizing the water temperature. However, if they are gone, of course, this stabilizing effect is lost. So somehow in the future, also these springs high up will have an increase in the water temperature, I guess.
Yeah,
Okay.
here in the United States, the montane areas, unfortunately, we're not permitted to use the phrase climate change in our federal proposals anymore. So call it weather pattern alteration. Um, this is affecting snowpack, and the snowpack is largely responsible for infiltration rates. Melting snow keeps the surface saturated and allows infiltration to occur. And with this weather pattern alteration, we're seeing that, and aridification, we're seeing reduced snowpack, later arrival of snow, earlier melting of snow, warmer temperatures creating more evaporation, so loss of that snowpack. Again, very little of the incoming precipitation especially in arid landscapes can be translated into infiltration. So that represents very much a long-term threat to our aquifers. We've got to say that there is misunderstanding about the nature of aquifers. We divide our watersheds, which are the groundwater catchment basins, into various levels, and the smallest level is even too large to understand the actual catchment areas of the smaller aquifers. Montane areas often have very small aquifers, and versus valley floors, which might have very large aquifers. So that difference in aquifer area matters a lot in terms of the ability of a catchment to be able to support springs.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. And there are actually no questions in the chat box. I have a lot of questions of my own here, but maybe if no one has any questions to ask, maybe I should sort of sidebar those questions with you another time. But Larry, there's just one question that has been burning away since you mentioned it right at the start. You said that there's only one American bird that's springs dependent, the American dipper. Why is that so? Why is the American dipper springs dependent?
The family Cinclidae, you have representatives in Europe. I'm not sure if they must be in England as well. But here in the Americas, 5 species, one of which has I think half a dozen subspecies across North America. The one subspecies that is truly springs dependent nests behind madiculous flow, which are sheets of white water. And it builds a nest of moss. It's a covered nest. And so the only places where we have sheets of meticulous flow in the Southwest are from spring-fed brooks. And therefore, this bird is really springs dependent in the Southwest, probably in much of North America, although it hasn't been studied like that. We typically don't pay much attention to spring brooks in river basin modeling. So springs are largely ignored in river basin modeling, which is unfortunate because, as I said, most of our rivers in North America are spring fed. The base flow is spring fed. So springs are providing the base flow of most of our rivers. That means that with springs not being included in river basin modeling, we need to rethink how springs should be included. We have a stream order system, a Stralarian system, going from small streams coupling to larger streams. Order 1 is typically where those basin models start. We need to consider springs as zero order streams, I think, to be able to bring them into river network modeling and better understand their contributions, not only to flow and water chemistry and to perhaps imprinting by fish that are migrating through these river systems. That's a big topic. Seems largely unknown, except for salmonids. We see evidence of it in cyprinids here. But also in terms of the contribution of springs to regional biodiversity. Springs often have kind of low individual biodiversity, alpha diversity, but contribute enormously to the gamma diversity of river basins.
Okay, brilliant. I just quickly Googled if there are Cyclades birds in Europe, and apparently the white-throated dipper, Cinclus cinclus, the only representative of the Cycladae family in Europe. And again, like the American dipper, it's usually found in fast-flowing streams and rivers and is a good indicator of water quality. Oh, there's a question in the question box. Kate Snadden again asks, how wide should an ecological buffer be to protect springs? That's a question to everyone.
Happy to address that unless somebody else has an answer. It's to protect from what? In situations in which vegetation has changed dramatically, you might have forests encroaching over springs. Springs are most productive when they're exposed to sunlight. Therefore, if you're managing for fire, do the experiment of burning across a spring and look at recovery. We haven't done those experiments yet, but understand what the role of fire might be in landscapes that might actually expand the biodiversity value of springs. That's an experiment to be done. I'm not suggesting that as a management strategy until we understand it better, but encroaching forest cover shades springs, and therefore opening them to sunlight is a big deal. So that's one question about what kind of management you're managing for. There are many other management questions. So if it's urbanization, that's a whole different study, a whole different kind of set of questions. Urbanization often covers springs over, and springs show up in people's basements in quite a few cities, which is not a very adequate way to either treat the spring or the colonization process. So Anybody else have comments there, I guess?
But there's no simple answer, I would say. Yeah, it's really not that easy.
I would want to also throw in an idea, Kate, is yes, from surface impacts that's maybe just driven over a certain distance. But if the major driving force is over abstraction of water, the one co-author, Nicolette Vermaak, explained to me, sometimes it's distance further away where you need your rainfall and recharge that happens irregularly, that then takes 2 years before it recharges the aquifer and then you have enough flow. So it's not just the superficial surface distance. And similar to microplastics, yes, it's also been found in our natural springs. There are papers on that. It is, again, a flow from elsewhere that then exits somewhere. So no, we as authors don't think that's the solution. It needs to be groundwater reserve determination. And that's when Nicolette also explained to me, it is so diverse across South Africa that you can't take one model from one study area and extrapolate that to the next, assuming that the Palliu River and the subsurface flow and clay is exactly the same as the other study. So there's a massive challenge in actually determining groundwater reserve, determination protected areas. That's just surface 2D is not going to work. It is a massive job towards it. And Michael, if I may ask my question that I always wanted to ask Larry and maybe Stefanie as well, how do we actually map the subsurface depth and character of these springs or what is the most efficient way? Do we already have these fancy robot systems because we can't sometimes walk to them? Can they just fly over and please do a quick 3D model scan for us over time?
Well, I'm sure we can turn to the hydrologic community for understanding where the saturated zone begins and ends around a spring through seismic technologies there. And I would love to see that done because we have no idea what's really going on subsurface in most of these springs. I want to make one other comment about management is that capping of springs is pretty much a universal issue. The source of the actually emergence point of the spring is usually the biodiversity hotspot. And were we to have the technology of flow splitters actively available, we could engage that technology, be able to leave some flow at the source and abstract the water for use purposes downstream without, killing the spring as we do by capping it.
And Larry, one more question is, what is the maximum depth that you ever measured for a spring? Have you ever done something amazing like that?
The maximum depth, sorry, of...
Yeah, so on your beautiful diagrams that you've shown, how do you determine the depth?
Yeah, so groundwater flow paths can extend quite deep into the crust, and typically the mineralogy and temperature of the spring will tell you something about the depth that it's been emerging from. Geothermal systems can also be, of course, very deep. Yeah.
Thanks.
Brilliant. Oh, another question. Julie, we had none at the start, and now we suddenly got a spring of questions on springs. Julie asks, why have springs historically been overlooked and underrepresented in national, regional, and international biodiversity conservation frameworks? Great question, Julie.
Well, it hasn't really been overlooked because you can see some of the earliest documentation is from the 1800s already. That classification of Kirkbrine is from 1919. But yes, not everything. And there's a wonderful document of Waring 1965, who has mapped and collected from all the museums and archives and created a world map in 1965 without GIS and internet data. And that's been recently converted to a global data set of the thermal springs. So I wouldn't think that it hasn't been done. I think we are now activating it more because of our spatial technologies, but also because of the GBF and the global ecosystem topology. So I would want to just view it a bit differently. Yeah.
I would add to Heidi's comment there that we have the issue of homology in all languages about springs, in that the word spring means so many things in every different language group that we look at that the hydrologic and meaning is often quite far down the list of definitions. And nowhere is the ecosystem ecology status of springs really recognized in language. So there's a fundamental issue with language or use of the word spring, uh, uh, and then that kind of trickles through to policy because then the policymakers don't pay much attention to these obscure things, and we're also dealing with kind of a black box universe below the spring. So there are many reasons why springs have been under investigated, even though there's been some great work. It remains kind of obscure to the public, I think.
Yeah, so I agree. So on the one hand, we have first studies from the early 20th century, the first typologies, for example, but on the other hand, we have this very focused look on the hydrology, drinking water supply, and so on. And that's the main reason, I guess, why it's so hard to implement the policy action and so on. It's really driven by this yeah human ecosystem service aspect. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you. Well, we're coming up to the hour. There's some really interesting points in the chat. Kate says, great answers. So thank you for the answers. And it really speaks to the complexity of these systems. And I think that's really what you have highlighted over the last 2 hours, just how complex and interesting and really overlooked currently and sort of understudied, aside from the work that you're doing and your colleagues and a few other people, that they're really for places that punch so above their weight in terms of biodiversity and endemism and all the other fascinating things you mentioned. They really aren't studied that much. So, guys, thank you so much for your time. Um, if there are no more questions, I'm just going to wrap up now. Brilliant. But if anybody in the audience has any questions that weren't answered during the webinar, please do email them to info@shoal.org. I'll forward it on to Larry, Stefanie, and Heidi and get back to you very soon. This webinar has been recorded, so feel free to share over social media, ideally with Shoal tagged so that we can repost. If you'd like to rewatch it or know of anybody who was hoping to watch it but couldn't make it, you'll be able to find it online from tomorrow at youtube.com/at shoal_org or go to the Shoal website, shoal.org, click news and stories and then videos. This was the first of the season on springs. We've got an exciting couple of months lined up. Chuli U, who just asked that last question, she has written a blog post about springs, about all things springs. Go over to the Shoal website and take a look at that. And our next season on springs webinar will be on the 27th of May at the same time, 1500 to 1700 BST. And you can find the sign-up details over at Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook pages. We'll also include them in next week's newsletter. We have another brilliant panel lined up, and we'll hear some fantastic stories, including one that I'm really personally looking forward to called the Diabolical Survival in Death Valley and what we can learn from endangered pup fishes. It's sure to be fantastic. So remember to sign up and make a note in your calendars. Guys, thank you so much again. That's it for now. Thanks everyone for joining us. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day and see you next time.
Thank you so much, Michael, for organizing and facilitating.
Yes. Thank you. And thank the audience as well for their attention.
Yeah, thank you for all your brilliant questions. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, everyone. See you. Bye.
Adieu.
Bye-bye.